They mistook your empathy for weakness. That's why they kept pushing. That's why they kept crossing your boundaries. That's why they kept taking more than they gave. That's why they kept expecting another chance. That's why they kept assuming that your kindness had no limits. Because in their mind, your empathy meant you'd always understand. Your empathy meant you'd always forgive. They confused compassion with permission. Think about that. They believed that your heart gave them access. Unlimited access. Access to your time, access to your energy, access to your peace, access to your patience, access to your forgiveness. And the longer you continued showing up, the more convinced they became that they were right. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe every time they disappointed you, you tried to understand where they were coming from. Maybe every time that they hurt you, you looked for the pain behind the behavior. Maybe every time they crossed another line, you told yourself, they've just been through a lot. They didn't really mean it. They'll change. They're trying. Because that's what empathetic people do. They look beneath the behavior. They try to understand the wound. They search for the reason. And there's nothing wrong with that until understanding someone else comes at the expense of understanding yourself. That's where everything starts changing. Because here's what they never realized. Empathy doesn't mean you stop having needs. Empathy doesn't mean that you stop having boundaries. Empathy doesn't mean you stop deserving respect. Empathy doesn't mean you become responsible for another adult's choices. Those are two very different things. And honestly, that's one of the hardest lessons for compassionate people to learn. Not because they're weak, because they genuinely want to believe the best in people. They don't walk into relationships looking for reasons to leave. They walk into relationships looking for reasons to stay. And that's beautiful, but it can also become dangerous. Because while you're trying to understand them, they may be trying to see how much you'll tolerate. While you're giving another chance, they're testing another boundary. While you're explaining away their behavior, they're becoming more comfortable repeating it. And maybe, if we're being honest, there were seasons where they were right. Maybe there was a version of you that believed that love meant endless sacrifice. Maybe there was a version of you that thought that saying no made you selfish. Maybe there was a version of you that confused guilt with compassion. Maybe there was a version of you that believed protecting yourself meant you weren't loving enough. So every time they crossed another line, they weren't taking a risk. They were following a pattern because that pattern had always worked before. But here's what they never expected. What if your empathy wasn't disappearing? What if it was finally becoming wise? Think about that. What if you didn't stop being compassionate? What if you simply stopped confusing compassion with self-abandonment? That's a completely different conversation because empathy isn't the problem. The absence of boundaries is. See, they didn't mistake your empathy for weakness. They mistook your willingness to tolerate disrespect for weakness. And maybe, for a season, those look the same, but they're not. One comes from love, the other comes from fear. Fear of conflict, fear of losing people, fear of disappointing people, fear of being misunderstood. And eventually, you stopped asking, how do I get them to appreciate everything I do? And you started asking, why do I keep believing that love requires me to disappear? That's the question that changes everything. Because now you're no longer trying to earn love by abandoning yourself. You're learning that real love has room for honesty. Real love has room for boundaries. Real love has room for self-respect. And one of the things I always say is this: the people who deserve the most understanding should never receive it at the expense of their own well-being. And whether you understand that psychologically, spiritually, philosophically, or simply through your own life experiences, the principle remains the same. Empathy is one of the most beautiful qualities a person can have. It just needs discernment standing beside it. And before we go any further, let me share something with you real quick. Around 77% of the people who watch these videos aren't subscribed yet. Only about 23% are. So if you've been growing with this community, if these conversations have helped you see yourself differently, I'd love for you to subscribe. It really helps these messages reach people who need them the most. Now, that's one of the biggest reasons I do what I do. I help people reinterpret their past so that they can reclaim their future. Because maybe what happened didn't mean you loved too much. Maybe it meant you hadn't learned that loving others and loving yourself were supposed to exist together. Maybe what happened wasn't evidence that your empathy was the problem. Maybe it was teaching you that empathy without boundaries eventually becomes self-neglect. Those are two very different stories, you see. And the story that you believe becomes the life that you create. And that's exactly why I wrote Phoenix from Stability to Power. Because there comes a point where every compassionate person has to stop asking, how do I keep proving my love? And start asking, how do I love people without losing myself? And that's what Phoenix is about. Learning to trust yourself, learning to set boundaries without guilt, because learning that protecting your peace doesn't make you cold. It makes your love healthier. You see, they mistook your empathy for weakness. They thought you'd keep understanding. They thought that you would keep forgiving. They thought that you would keep shrinking. They thought you'd keep choosing everyone else before yourself. They never expected your empathy to grow into discernment. They never expected your kindness to find boundaries. They never expected the person who understood everyone else to finally understand themselves. You see, the real victory wasn't becoming less loving. The real victory was learning that you could love deeply without leaving yourself behind. Peace, blessings, love, and power.